The Glimpse.
Make audible the inaudible and visible the invisible, right? Like, as in, again, there's a microphone here in front of me. What do I do with the microphone? What do I speak about? What do I, And also, what is your responsibility? What is it your responsibility to know and to kind of like get messy around,
Welcome to The Glimpse. I'm your host, Camille Rankine. Poet Solmaz Sharif isn't afraid to use her microphone. She's the author of the books Customs and Look, a finalist for the National Book Award. She's the recipient of a Discovery Poetry Prize, the Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award, and fellowships from the NEA, the Lanham Foundation, and Stanford University. Solmaz is our guest today on The Glimpse. In Solmaz Sharif's poetry, no words are wasted. It's a work of precision, careful attention to language and the lies language can tell if we let it. Her latest book, Customs, carves through silence in a lyric that is spare and unsparing, exact and exacting, resolute and tender at the same time. The poems consider the grief of exile, examining the performances American society demands of those who must contend with its borders, and revealing the quiet absurdities and cruelties of American life. Welcome, Solmaz. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Camille. Thanks. It's an honor to be here and a joy to be here with you in particular. So thank you.
I love your work, so I'm very excited about our conversation.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about silence, actually. I mentioned it in my intro, and I often think about your work as contending with silence, like through white space or through its interrogation of euphemism and the things that kind of lurk beneath our speech. So I wanted to ask about your relationship to silence.
Yeah, I think my relationship to silence started from a very contentious place, thinking in terms of those who are silenced, narratives that are silenced, lives that are silenced, the various silences in literature in English and how to kind of fill them. The idea of, like Audre Lorde's idea of like your silence will not protect you, will not save you, and that there's just a limited amount of time that we have with each other where we have to speak with each other and what it means to break those silences and make use of that time. And I think the more I've stayed with poetry and devoted my life to poetry, I've also come to appreciate a very particular kind of silence that can happen within it. Mm-hmm. Yes, it can diagnose and interrupt and replicate or rewrite the silences of state-sponsored violence and language. And also it can invite and require a particular kind of silence that settles in between words and after the reading of a poem that has a very different quality to me. And so, the idea of writing with silence as well as against it has been a more recent kind of evolution, I think.
Yeah. Do you feel like that's a recent evolution in your own work or in poetry in general?
Yes. No, in my own work, for sure. Yeah. I mean, silence was a bad word for me, like it was just like, it was not the thing that was supposed to exist.
Yeah.
I grew up around people who like very literally put their lives on the line, talking and acting. It's a part of like a person's responsibility to break the silences.
Right.
But then something happens when you stay in the poem, and you realize that it's the silence that's making the music. And of course, there are different silences, and there's like a very particular power to sitting in silence with someone.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about the Quakers. I think the Quakers do that.
Yeah.
I don't know much about Quakers.
Yeah.
But I do know that's a part of their practice, which I think is really interesting. And then to speak out in that silence, to say something that they need to say or move to say in the moment, which I think it's an interesting thing to think about, like in terms of poetry as well, how maybe, like you were saying, like staying in the poem, moving through silence to the next thing is a part of the practice as well. Mm-hmm. I find that compelling.
I totally agree. And just the idea of like if you're not moved to say something, it's okay to not say it, right?
I think people should remember that.
People really,
Like, you don't have to say everything.
we really don't. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it kind of leads to an economy of language, and also that because of that like contrast against silence, there's a sort of power that language can have when you feel or see, or that silence becomes like a presence, you know? Then the language cutting through it, there's a power in that movement through the silence. That's like something that poetry can do. I think that other kinds of texts can do it too, but poetry can do it in a way that I think is unique to poetry.
I agree. I think often of like the experience of being with somebody and trying to remember a joke, and you both know the joke, right? And that moment where you're trying to find, wait, what was the punchline? What was the story? You know, but you're both also experiencing the joke. There's something to that feeling that feels akin to poetry to me, which is that the poem is actually not so much the act of the saying of it, but the resonance that exists just before the saying of it. And the poem actually kind of kills it, you know, like it ends it. So the joke is never better than that experience of trying to find the joke or remember the joke again. So I'm always trying to actually chase something that is like pre-language, you know, but through language, which just feels obviously impossible.
Right.
But like a very enjoyable impossibility for me.
Yeah, I like that idea of the anticipation of something that you know is coming but don't have the language for yet. And that just sitting in that moment just before, and then the language coming, and they're like, you know, it's satisfying, but also sort of like, well, now that moment's over.
Now the moment's gone. And the moment will forever be changed by its naming, you know? And so every time you return to it, it's kind of different, but yeah.
Yeah. So let's turn toward your poem. Do you want to introduce it? Or you can just jump right in and read it if you'd like.
I'll introduce it by saying that what I'm about to read is a part of a longer poem that appears in Customs called "And Otherwise." It's the closing section of Customs. And I'll just read it now, this little bit. What did you leave behind? We answered, a pool lined with evergreens, needles falling into water, its floor painted milky jade. A car in the driveway, a mother, another mother, a cockatiel in the hallway squawking next to the plastic slippers. Glass after beveled glass, secret after beveled secret, letters from a first crush now dead, killed. We wanted to be asked of these things. To tell of them was to live again. We spent much of our lives imagining. We rathered and rathered, scraping the soft moss off the gravestones of our early curiosities.
Thank you. It's a beautiful poem, or section of poem, really.
Thank you.
So I was thinking about the images you open the poem with. You have this sort of list of objects that are kind of a sketch of a life that was. And I wondered how you made the choices of what to include there, those images that you include.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, they're not really from my own life, actually. Or some of them are, some of them aren't. I can say that I am not a particularly imaginative poet. So if there's a detail in a poem, it tends to have been something I saw and just kind of, you know, like a little like raccoon scavenger, you know, energy around images and just bringing them and putting them in places that they don't necessarily belong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that you say that you're not imaginative. I mean, I feel better hearing that, because I feel like I'm not either.
Yeah, good.
I feel like my imagination I'm so practical. And so,
yeah.
when I'm thinking about that moment in the poem where you say, we wanted to be asked of these things, to tell them was to live again. And I was interested in that because it's as if in that moment, life is something that happened before. And it's like there's an ending And I'm thinking about this too in terms of like the notion of, or the narrative we have around immigration arriving in America. And America wants the story to be that you get here and your life starts, you know? Is this sort of a reversal of that? Like I'm thinking about that idea of that backward looking, thinking about that being a space of possibility and curiosity and life that's over. And we don't really have a picture of life now in that moment in the poem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a kind of nostalgic melancholy that is often a part of stories of exile. And I was thinking about this kind of long arc of loss and the fantasies that one keeps kind of circling and this kind of like frozen moment that one tends to return to.
Yeah.
And I think I selected this poem. It's been months now, right?
Yeah.
And I, this morning I was like, wait, why did I? But I think what it was in the moment I was thinking about Palestine, and it was November maybe, and I was already thinking about the long arc of return, and not even like the continued genocide or spectacular moment of the present. And now it feels even more useless, so to speak. But I think so much of my work is invested in, continuing to name the private and long duration of the impacts of violence and kind of state-sponsored aggression in our lives. And, usually I don't talk about like anecdotes that are related to images here, but the moment here of the cockatiels in the hallway, there was a particular mother whose son had been imprisoned for political activity, and this was in the 80s, and she had tried to go and visit him, and she said they wouldn't let her in, so she started hitting her head against the prison wall, and then she said she's had the same headache since, I mean, that is the poem, right? I mean, that's done. Like, she said the poem. And I always wonder about what to bring in and what to leave out. But I wanted to break the silence of the prison wall and the prisoners and I wanted to name the story of this woman, for example. And she's never made it into a poem except for this one fragment that nobody will know has this backstory to it. But what if we approached each image like that, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's interesting, the idea that that narrative, that story is appearing in the way that it guides the way that you tell other stories or the way that you craft other poems. And yeah, maybe that's a way of breaking through the prison wall, breaking through a silence, even if you're the only one that recognizes that direct connection.
Or maybe it's me hitting my head against it. I'm not sure, but
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I guess, as long as that story is still a part of what guides you, maybe it's you're hitting your head against it, but maybe you won't always be,
Mm-hmm.
if it's still carrying you forward in your work. That's just me being hopeful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, on that note, let's take a little break.
We hope you're enjoying The Glimpse. It's just one small part of the Adrian Brinkerhoff Poetry Foundation.
We're the founders, Peter
and Kathy Halstead. Our goal is to make poetry more accessible to everyone, and we do that in a variety of ways. Through partnerships, our film series, this podcast, and our website, brinkerhoffpoetry.org.
We hope these works will lure you into a parallel universe, the way a Mobius strip brings you into another dimension without leaving the page you're on. Thanks for listening.
We're back. Solmaz, you're going to share a poem that has inspired you.
Yes.
Would you like to introduce it? Tell us a little bit about what you've brought to share.
So it's a poem by June Jordan, and it's from her collection entitled Living Room. And the poem kind of introduces itself, so I'll just read it. The title is Moving Towards Home. It opens with an epigraph, which reads, "Where is Abu Fadi?" she wailed, "and who will bring me my loved one?" New York Times, September 20th, 1982. I do not wish to speak about the bulldozer and the red dirt, not quite covering all of the arms and legs. Nor do I wish to speak about the night-long screams that reached the observation posts where soldiers lounged about. Nor do I wish to speak about the woman who shoved her baby into the stranger's hands before she was led away. Nor do I wish to speak about the father whose sons were shot through the head while they slit his own throat before the eyes of his wife. Nor do I wish to speak about the army that lit continuous flares into the darkness so that the others could see the backs of their victims lined against the wall. Nor do I wish to speak about the piled-up bodies and the stench that will not float. Nor do I wish to speak about the nurse again and again raped before they murdered her on the hospital floor. Nor do I wish to speak about the rattling bullets that did not halt on that keening trajectory. Nor do I wish to speak about the pounding on the doors and the breaking of windows and the hauling of families into the world of the dead. I do not wish to speak about the bulldozer and the red dirt, not quite covering all of the arms and legs, because I do not wish to speak about unspeakable events that must follow from those who dare to purify a people, those who dare to exterminate a people, those who dare to describe human beings as beasts with two legs, those who dare to mop up, to tighten the noose, to step up the military pressure, to ring around civilian streets with tanks, those who dare to close the universities, to abolish the press, to kill the elected representatives of the people who refuse to be purified, those are the ones from whom we must redeem the words of our beginning. Because I need to speak about home. I need to speak about living room, where the land is not bullied and beaten into a tombstone. I need to speak about living room where the talk will take place in my language. I need to speak about living room where my children will grow without horror. I need to speak about living room where the men of my family between the ages of 6 and 65 are not marched into a roundup that leads to the grave. I need to talk about living room where I can sit without grief, without wailing aloud for my loved ones, where I must not ask, where is Abu Fadi, because he will be there beside me. I need to talk about living room because I need to talk about home. I was born a Black woman, and now I am become a Palestinian. Against the relentless laughter of evil, there is less and less living room, and where are my loved ones? It is time to make our way home.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing this. I've read this poem before, and every time I read it, I feel more affected by it. Mm-hmm. What is it about this poem that draws you to it?
I first encountered this poem when I was an undergrad at UC Berkeley. June Jordan had started a program called Poetry for the People that I was a part of. She died the summer I first took the course, so I never actually got a chance to work with her, but I worked with the students who had worked with her, and she was kind of one of my first teachers and turning toward the language of the state and of the ways that violence is premeditated in language itself, and kind of the role of the poet around a caretaking of language. So there was that. There was also the fact that she is so boldly and brazenly naming a bodily solidarity with Palestinians, the very construction of I am become as opposed to I am like, or I become, or, you know, there is a grammar of solidarity, of like withness, you know, that is pointing to someone who is in it and is in it to stay. Yeah. And in fact, like the first time she read this poem, it was a part of a reading that she had put together in 1982. This is the Israeli incursion and war in Lebanon and on Lebanon, and in particular massacres of Palestinian refugees at Sabra and Shatila. And in light of these events, she attempted in 1982 along with two other poets, Kathy Engel and Sarah Miles, to put together a reading that featured Israeli poets alongside American poets, alongside Arab poets. Notably, Mahmoud Darwish was supposed to attend, but his visa was denied, so he was not there. There were a number of Israeli poets, and June herself read, Etel Adnan read, but in the end, really no Palestinian poets other than one as a translator. And it was a fundraiser for UNICEF, for children, for the children of Lebanon. She, upon reading this poem, many in the audience were upset. One of the Israeli poets present said that Black woman over there should die in the green fire is the quote. And
it's interesting that she had to, like, that person had to name Black woman.
Yes.
As like,
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
It's telling.
She felt, and I felt as a young poet too, an immediate understanding that this cost her a lot in her career.
Mm-hmm.
After this poem and in this book, she's not published or she's not reviewed in the New York Times until she dies.
Wow.
It's not a great review either. And she certainly wasn't invited to read at the 92nd Y, and that was always a question for her. So for me, this poem has always been a central touchstone through a number of ways in terms of like laying bare, for example, the kind of political underpinnings of how form and craft are taught. Mm-hmm. Because I've been taught anaphora, for example, and I have never been taught a poem like this. I haven't been taught a poem about my rights in that context.
Right.
So, all the ways that work like this gets, marginalized or pushed aside, and then all the danger and risk that it kind of brought to her and the friendships that it cost.
Wow.
In what was a very lonely time,
It's pretty incredible to think about what it cost and how much of a risk it was. Looking at the poem and thinking about like what she says here and what she doesn't say.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for example, she doesn't name Israel or the IDF in this poem at all. And I wonder what you think about the fact that they aren't named, they aren't present here. Like, what do you make of that?
It is. I mean, that's an interesting choice to bring up because there are poems where she names FBI, CIA, and poem about
right.
And really, other than like Abu Fadi, right, which could be any number of people, it's certainly, but it's not until the appearance of the word Palestinian, mm-hmm. right, that we even get a kind of context. And so, to me, the more animating thing is like, I don't need it to be here. And it also makes the anger against the poem that much more.
Right? That's what I'm thinking. Like, you're so mad, but she didn't even say your name.
Yes.
And I think that was a choice.
Yes. She said, people who say beast with two legs and you're mad, And she said Palestinian and you're mad.
Right. It's like you saw yourself.
Yes.
And also having read the article that's quoted here and knowing where a lot of this, like, not all of this language, but there's a lot of language and image from that article that mm-hmm. is present here. I think that's one of the things that's interesting is that thinking about what you're saying about language and the language of the state and how this is like one of the models for you for how that can be deployed in a poem and reworked and kind of used in another direction.
Mm-hmm.
To make visible how the state contorts language and uses language as a weapon. Mm-hmm. Thinking about that, it's so interesting that she just so frequently uses their own language, right? Mm-hmm. Puts it in the poem, doesn't attach it to a source. And then there's so much rage about that. And she just said what you said.
Yeah.
She just said what you said. And then she said the word Palestinian.
She just quoted.
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting.
And she said, I am a Black woman and I am become a Palestinian, right? So it's
all of those things.
Yeah.
It's just so fascinating to me to think about the power of that, the power of just stating what happened and how strange it is that can be controversial and dangerous. It's interesting to me that the poem begins with so much negation of what we're not going to do. Like, here's what mm-hmm. we're not going to do. But at the same time, even in her refusal to make it the subject, she still brings it into the space of the poem. Like that violence, that imagery is still with us, even though she's not asking us to look at that right now. I think that's an interesting sort of maybe sleight of hand, but also a way of sort of refusing that spectacle. Like she's not asking us to be spectators in that way. She's asking us to imagine something else.
Yeah. And I think, too, there's this sense of turning toward something out of urgency and a kind of calling or duty, and laying it bare without hyperbole.
Yeah.
That's something I've learned from the context of just writing about Palestine in general, of just like facts in the basic sense are enough.
Yes.
We don't need simile. We don't need hyperbole. It is hyperbolic. Like it is, you know? And let the is itself do the work that it will do, right? Rather than have the poem make it into a thing. And the provocation in the end, it's, the reader, you decide, like, is this your language or not? You know? Like, and is this your language or not?
Yeah.
Is the word and identity and the self Palestinian so dangerous and threatening and despised to you that it incites such a reaction or not, you know?
Yeah. When I hear about the reaction, I just want to say, like, what are you mad about? Tell me, like, where's the lie? Are we speaking a different language? I guess maybe we are.
Yeah,
like,
we are. Yeah.
We are. I don't understand sometimes how I'm looking at this fact and you're looking at that fact and we're getting two different pictures. Like, I just think it's it's a little bit disorienting, you know? So looking at this poem and its ending and thinking, what? Like, why? Why is your reaction like, this Black woman needs to go die?
It is absurd.
Yeah. But I'm thinking about the loved ones and, you know, who is she calling in that moment? Do you think, like, what do you think about that invitation or that question and who it, you know, we're talking about, like, is this your language? Is that also a moment of calling out to the reader and asking,
absolutely,
are we her loved ones as well, you know?
Absolutely. And I do think the invitation is that broad too, you know, and we see that kind of between identity and positionality. Like, it matters. We're naming and we're not pretending these things don't exist or that one abandons one's self as a Black woman or abandons oneself as a Palestinian or needs to become or not. But what does it mean to identify oneself as a loved one? And what kinds of requirements does that then place on us,
yes.
Right? I mean, we're talking about the cost of her career and all those things, but I think for June and for poets that I really admire and respect in the end, it really is about your life. Like, it's not just your livelihood, but it's like, I would put my life on the line. You know, like, I would, like, that's it, you know? And I think this is one of those places of kind of invitation and what it means, what sorts of self transformations and honorings will allow us to be in what she called, you know, and what, like, Martin Luther King Jr. called beloved community with each other.
Yeah.
She would say, make audible the inaudible and visible the invisible, right? Like, as in, again, there's a microphone here in front of me. What do I do with the microphone? What do I speak about? What do I, you know? And also, what is your responsibility? What is it your responsibility to know and to kind of, like, get messy around, you know? She was somebody who insisted that we move toward those difficult connections and spaces.
I wonder if there is a we that can exist. Maybe not. Maybe the answer is just no. But I want to ask about one more thing with this poem, and that's that phrase living room and what you make of that. It's just those two words together repeated. And I wonder what it stands for. Like, what is it for you, that phrase?
Yeah, I think a living room, like the idea of a domestic space where people gather, where guests are also invited. It's not the bedroom, it's not the kitchen, it's receptive, and also where one conceivably would spend a lot of one's time at home. And then also just like room to live, you know, what it means to, and especially writing a book that is about Lebanon, but in particular about, you know, settler colonialism and Israel in Palestine and on Palestine, what it means to create for oneself and insist on the room to live, you know? So I think it's both of those things.
I like that just in the removal of that one article, we're pushed into that space of conceptualizing what this might mean, the idea of just a shared space for living, for that, you know, something that you share with loved ones, that it's just about life and whatever that might contain, but life and not death and not cruelty, you know? I'm really happy to have spent such close time with this poem for this and be thinking about it in those terms. So thank you. Thank you for bringing it to the attention of this podcast, you know, and the listeners.
Thank you so much, Camille. Yeah, thank you.
And I want to ask you, what are you up to? What's your next project look like, if it exists in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I'm writing. I'm always writing. It's hard to say. It's really hard to think about anything. I would say most of my heart and attention is like turned toward a free Palestine right now. And it's coming in my work, but I don't know what a project is anymore, you know?
Yeah, I think it's a strange time to be writing.
Bless the ones that are bringing about the change.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you for being here, surreal as it may
Thank
be. Thanks for talking with me.
Thanks, Camille.
Thanks for joining us today. I'm your host, Camille Rankine. Solmaz's poem, What Did You Leave Behind, from her book Customs, published in 2022, was used with permission from Grey Wolf Press. June Jordan's poem, Moving Towards Home, is from Directed by Desire, the complete poems of June Jordan, published by Copper Canyon Press. Copyright Christopher D. Meyer, 2007. It was aired with the permission of the Francis Golden Literary Agency. Join us next week for a frank discussion with guest Omatara James on apocalypses, body shaming, and recognizing love and tenderness in the face of death. Make sure to like and subscribe to The Glimpse wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find episodes on our website, brinkerhoffpoetry.org. If you have any questions or comments, please drop us an email at theglimpsepoetrypodcast@gmail.com. The Glimpse is a production of the Adrian Brinkerhoff Poetry Foundation. I'm your host, Camille Rankine. Our senior producer is Jennifer Wolfe. Kat Yours, our technical director and mixing engineer. Editorial director Amanda Glassman is our curator and production coordinator. Amy Holmes is the Foundation's executive director, and our co-founders are Kathy and Peter Halstead. Thanks for listening.